Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So, London, 1794, by William Blake. So, summary and brief context. This poem is about a man, the poet himself in this case, who walks around London and sees poverty and misery everywhere. The poverty arose as a result of the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1750 to 1850. You can't be exact with these dates, but these are nice, easy dates to remember, which made a few people very rich, but made everyone else miserable. It also led to child labor because children had to work to support their families. So there we have William Blake. So a little bit about the poet. 1757 to 1827, and he was born in London, England. So remember that the dates in the overview videos are the dates of birth of the poets, okay, not the dates of publication of the poems themselves, which are in this video. He was an English poet and painter, and although he was considered mad by his contemporaries, in other words, the people around him at the time, he later came to be highly regarded. His paintings and poetry have been characterized as part of the Romantic period, as pre-Romantic. So if we just go back, so 1794, the official start of the Romantic era was 1798. So this is 4 years before that. So that kind of makes sense. And he was a committed Christian, but was hostile. He was against the Church of England and to organized religion. And he was influenced by the ideals and ambitions of the French and American revolutions. So here is a glossary for the poem. Please pause the video and try to learn these words, or at the very least, read through them 2 or 3 times so that when you study the poem, it's a bit easier to understand. And these are some of the techniques used in the poem. So remember the overview videos, go through these in more detail. If you haven't seen the overview videos yet, please do that first before you go through the individual poem videos. Okay, so we're going to listen to the poem, an audio version read by the great Idris Elba, and then we'll go through it.
I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening churches appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, rums in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
Okay, so in many ways, this is a fairly straightforward poem, but bits of it can be tricky. So starts with I, the first person. So this is the poet, the narrator speaking, and he's walking through the streets of London. So chartered means to own, to be mapped, okay? And it's repeated here. So, and I'll explain that in a minute. This is an old spelling for through. And he's walking near the River Thames, and he repeats that this is also chartered. So this idea of being mapped and owned by the rich, okay, as opposed to the poor. And mark means two things. It's like a dirty spot on something, but it also means to notice, okay? So he says he notices in every face that he sees or meets, and here, dirty spots. Now that could be, well, marks of weakness and marks of woe. So woe means sadness. All right. So these could be physical kind of dirty marks, okay, or just the expressions on their faces. And then here he's repeating every, and everybody's crying, the men and the children. In the case of the men, it's probably metaphorical, but in the case of the children, it's probably literal, real. Okay. The word van can mean two things. It can mean like an announcement, but it also can mean when you stop something. So in that, both of those meanings make sense in this case. Okay. So the rich people telling the poor people what to do, or stopping poor people from doing various things. And then here we have alliteration and a metaphor. So mind forged manacles. So this means handcuffs. But in this case, they are metaphorical. They're in the mind. They're mental and emotional. And forged is interesting. It means to make, but in this case, to make things of metal. So this is a reference to the Industrial Revolution, to the factories. Okay. And chimney sweepers is talking about the children, child labor. So children did many jobs. One of them was to climb up chimneys and clean them. And as you can imagine, that was a very dirty job and a difficult job, but also a dangerous job. The soot would get into their lungs and cause diseases and early death. Now, the rest of this stanza is a little bit tricky, so I'm going to skip through it for now until we get to the second reading. Remember in these videos, as I mentioned in the overview videos, we go through the poems 2 or 3 times at different levels. But this blackening here could be a reference to the soot, the black soot. And this here is a reference to the French Revolution, okay, which had happened just a few years before that. Okay, I'll go through that in a bit more detail later. And then here he carries on. He's walking around at midnight. And so this word harlot means prostitute. Okay. But the point here being that these were young women who could not afford to look after themselves and their children. And they basically had to sell themselves in order to do that. And then curse can mean like a swear word, or it could just be an expression of feeling. So these poor young women, the mothers, are cursing, are swearing, or shouting, and that's being heard by their children. And obviously, it's not something that the children should be hearing. And in fact, it implies that they had their children with them in the streets. So blight means to affect in a bad way, and plague obviously means diseases and so on. And marriage hearse, here we have an oxymoron. So obviously marriage has positive connotations, but hearse is something that carries a dead body. Okay. So this is an oxymoron. So suggesting that these women should have been happily married, but instead they're not, and possibly suggesting that they also end up having an early death and so on and being carried off in these verses. Okay, so hopefully you now understand the poem. So remember AO1 to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. So we have read it, we have understood it, and then you can respond with these quotes here. These are just some suggestions. I'm not going to go through them. I've done that as we went through the poem. And in particular, the poem uses these techniques. Okay. You might want to pause the video here and just have a think about these things. But just moving on. So AO2, language, form, structure, techniques, and terminology. So language, remember from the overview video, means words and phrases. And then you have to discuss their effects and connotations. So this means thoughts and feelings and images. This means alternative meanings of a word. So we talked about the effects and connotations of chartered and this quote here and the oxymoron here. And the form and structure. So this poem is composed of 4 quatrains, And a quatrain is a 4-line stanza. So quatrain, quarter, meaning 4, and is told in the first person throughout. And in terms of techniques and terminology, Blake uses repetition in particular, but also metaphor and oxymoron. Yeah. In terms of context, AO3, remember you don't need a lot of context for the poetry. Some good points to make would be as follows. So Blake's interest in equality and the fight against poverty as influenced by the French and American revolutions. So they were about equality. And Blake's hostility to the Church of England and to organized religion despite being a committed Christian. So that reference to the church in the poem. And you could mention the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So I'm not going to go through the questions. Please pause the video here and make sure that you can answer these questions. If not, you'll need to go back and listen again, or you can go to the end of the video and then go back, okay? So I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, and moving on. So here are the answers. I'm not going to go through them, but please pause the video here. Check your answers. Make sure that you were able to answer most of them. You're aiming for at least 50%, but kind of 70, 90, 100% really, okay? And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So for example, you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of inequality in London compared with one other poem in the anthology? So we're not going to do that here, but you could compare with Ozymandias or My Last Duchess. And you might start something like this. The poet presents the theme of inequality by describing how he walks around London and sees signs of poverty everywhere, whereas the streets and the river are owned by the rich and powerful. He uses techniques such as repetition and metaphor to do this. So your introduction will always be a brief answer to the question, a brief summary of the poem, and then maybe mention 1 or 2 techniques, not all of them. And then your first point might be, the poem begins by describing, in stanza 1, how the poet walks around London and sees marks of weakness, marks of woe everywhere. So notice how I weave in the quote. He uses repetition with the noun marks, and he also uses the abstract noun woe, which means great sorrow. The effect of the repetition emphasizes that the sadness is everywhere. So notice I'm making my points, I'm giving my evidence, I'm identifying techniques, I'm picking out words. Remember that word classes are also techniques, and I'm talking about effects. Okay. You also need to talk about connotations, that you can do that later in your different points. So something like this, an introduction and a conclusion, and just about 4 paragraphs like this would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5 and a little bit of context. Okay. So that's grade 4 or 5. To progress to grade 6 or 7 and above, you can carry on. So let's look at the poem again for these things. So tone and mood. So tone is the attitude of the poet, and the mood is the feelings created. So notice here, I've just changed the format simply so that it will fit on 1 page. There should actually be blank lines in between here. And this indentation is not in the original, okay? You saw the original earlier. I've just done this to make it easier to study. So I think, so the tone of the poem, you can hopefully agree, the poet is angry and sad. And similarly, when we read and hear the poem, we feel the same. So in this case, the tone and mood are kind of the same. Remember from the overview videos, tone and mood can either be similar or the same, or they can be different. In this case, they're the same. Rhyme and rhythm, let's see if it rhymes. So street, flow, meet, woe. So that there's an A-B rhyme scheme. Man, fear, ban, here. So you can see that there's a defined rhyme scheme. And that's probably because he was a very traditional poet, and in those days, poetry, generally speaking, was required to rhyme. In terms of rhythm, if you count the number of syllables, you'll find that there's 8 syllables in each line, or most of the lines. Okay, so that's called tetrameter. So tetra means 4, and meter, remember, means 2 syllables. It's a poetic meter. So you don't need to go into too much detail with rhyme and rhythm, as long as you mention them and say something about them. So in this case, I would say in many ways, he was a rebel, but in other ways, he was quite a traditional kind of poet. Um, and so therefore he uses these traditional rhyme and rhythms. And in terms of going a bit deeper into these things here, I think we've discussed most of what we need to do, but just thinking about this stanza here, if you're aiming for the higher grades, this is a stanza that you would want to impress your examiner with. So with these difficult stanzas, usually there's no fixed meaning, and if you're aiming for the higher grades, what the examiners are looking for is whether you can discuss alternative interpretations, and then possibly come up with a summary of your opinion, or you don't even have to do that, as long as you can discuss the uh, various possibilities. So, for example, here, blackening, as I mentioned earlier, could refer to the black soot, or it could just be the connotations of black as in being bad and evil. Hapless means unfortunate, and this is a reference to the French Revolution, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the French Revolution started in 1789. It carried on for quite a few years, but that was the start date. So that was about 5 years before this poem was written and published. The American Revolution was in 1765, so that was about 29, 30 years before that. Okay, so you could mention these kind of things. So yeah, if you can just discuss this stanza, talk about various possibilities, mention these revolutions and the dates, that would be more than enough to go to grade 6 or 7. Okay, so I think that's enough for grade 6 or 7. Here is an advanced quiz to test your understanding of that so far. So please pause the video and have a good go at that. I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. So there are the answers. Please pause the video and check yours. And moving on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. And such a paragraph might look like this. So up to here is the same as before. And then you could add, Blake was influenced by the ideals of the French and American revolutions, and this is clearly evident in stanza 3, which otherwise seems very puzzling. Similarly, the references to churches in the same stanza make sense, given his antagonism, so this means hostility or being against the church, despite being a committed Christian himself. And then, so about 5 or 6 paragraphs like this would be more than enough to get you to grade 6 or 7. And then if you want to go on to grade 8 or 9, it's not about writing more paragraphs, okay? You don't need more than about 5 or 6 paragraphs. It then becomes about going deeper. And also, as I mentioned in the introduction videos, it's about making sure that your whole essay from beginning to end is almost perfect. But some possibilities of advanced points might be the following. So anybody who can explore stanza 3 in detail, the one we looked at briefly just now, the one that refers to the church and the soldiers. So depending on how deeply you went into that, how insightfully, and if you were able to make some original points or give your own thoughts and opinions on that, that would be potentially grade 8 or 9. You could explore tetrameter in more detail, or iambic tetrameter. So unstressed, stressed, and then the 4 syllables. Sorry, 8 syllables per line. Okay, 4 times 2 is 8. And you could talk about the French and American revolutions, but not too much. Okay, remember, for context, you don't need too much. It's more about the quality of what you say and how you can link it to the poem itself. And that's it. So if you can put all of that together and complete the essay we started, how does the poet present the theme of inequality in London? And normally you would have to compare, but in this case, you can just do this. So it's up to you what grade you want to aim for when you do this task, whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. And that's it. Hopefully you found that video useful. And if so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video.